Hey guys, this is a cool story. This one's called Act of God. Act of God. There are only two possible explanations for what you're about to hear. It was either the most phenomenal coincidence that ever occurred, or it was an act of God. Literally. And remember, as you learn what happened on that rainy Thursday afternoon over 100 years ago, that a stack of sworn statements and legal documents say that it was so. There was just one problem with Swan Quarter, North Carolina. It was in a lowland. So naturally, the choicest real estate was on the highest ground. In the event of heavy rain, the closer you were to sea level, the harder you were hit. Over 100 years ago, the Methodists of Swan Quarter had no church, and the only lot available on which to build was a plot of low-lying property on Oyster Creek Road. It was far from the ideal location, but they had acquired the land and construction began. The church was to be white frame, small but sturdy, propped up on brick pilings. In 1876, the building was completed, and on Sunday, September the 16th, a joyous dedication ceremony was celebrated. That was Sunday, September the 16th. 3 days later, on Wednesday, a terrible storm lashed Swan Quarter. All day the wind howled and the rain came down in a gray wall of water. By nightfall, devastation. Much of the town was flooded. Many roofs were ripped from homes by the cyclonic turbulence. The storm raged on through the night and into the bleak morning. By Thursday afternoon, the wind subsided. The rain all but stopped. For the first time in more than a day, there was an almost eerie calm. One by one, the citizens of Swan Quarter threw back the shutters and peered from what was left of their homes. Most saw only desolate waterscape, a community ravaged by nature, but those within the sight of Oyster Creek Road beheld the most incredible sight they had ever seen. The church, the Swan Quarter Methodist Church, the whole building intact, was floating down the street. The floodwaters had gently lifted the entire structure from the brick pilings on which it rested and had sent it off slowly, silently, down Oyster Creek Road. Within minutes, several concerned townsfolk were sloshing about in the streets, waist deep, fighting the rushing current, trying desperately to reach the still moving church so that they could moor it with lengths of rope. The ropes were fastened, but the effort was in vain. There was no stable structure secure enough to restrain the floating chapel. And as the building passed by, more attention was attracted, more aid was enlisted, but to no avail. The church moved on. By now, the building had made it to the center of town, still on Oyster Creek Road. Then, as dozens, amazed, helpless, watched, the Swan Quarter Methodist Church, still floating, made a sharp, inexplicable right turn and continued down that road, as though the chapel were alive and as though it had a mind of its own. For 2 more blocks, the townspeople fought the ropes to hold it back unsuccessfully. And then, in the same decisive manner with which it had moved, the church veered off the road, headed for the center of a vacant lot, and there stopped. While the flood water receded, the church remained and is there to this day. Over 100 Septembers have passed since the little white frame church removed itself to the most desirable property in Swan Quarter. In the process of making up your own mind as to how and why what happened, you ought to know this one more thing, the rest of the story. The choice Highland lot where the chapel settled was the first choice of the town Methodists for the site of their church. But the shrewd, prosperous landowner whose property it originally was turned them down. But the next morning after the flood, after discovering the church in the middle of his lot, that same landowner went to the Methodist minister and with trembling hands presented him with the deed to the property. Isn't that cool? And now you know the rest of the story. Bye-bye. Oh, and here's a picture of the church. Okay, so here's a picture of the church that floated down the street. And then, of course, you can see right next to it, you see a brick structure, and that's where they built, a brick church, getting away from the original wooden one. And according to this article, there was another flood in 2003 where this church was ruined in that flood, where the white frame building was ruined in that flood. But anyway, so and then again, this is the Virginia Pilot telling about this, and they tell the whole story here. You can actually look it up, but anyway, but that's what the church looked like. I thought that was cool. You show you a picture of it. So again, it's a true story. It really happened. So love you guys. Bye bye.